Hello everybody and welcome to the next part of this series. You may have noticed that in the past few days there weren't any new parts uploaded. I was pretty busy with other things and I don't know if I can keep up putting daily episodes online. But don't worry, I won't abandon this series and we gonna continue with our work. Last episode I showed you a little bit what Modo can do on the surface. Today we're gonna continue a little bit with that. Again, I have here in the upper right corner a little box that shows what my mouse and my keyboard are doing. And the first items that we're going to model are, besides stuff that we will have in our inventory that we're gonna build, are some things to populate our world. And I want to start off with a little hut that we set up in modular pieces, so that in the engine we can use blueprints to define a little bit the appearance and structure of our little hut and have some variety. Then we start off with a box and we put it 400 by 400 millimeters and 2.5 meters in height. We put it in the center and so that it just goes to the ground. Then we delete the bottom, we don't need that. And we go to our duplicate tool and create an array, but with only 2 copies, or rather 1 copy, additional copy in the Z direction. The X direction is okay. We set this, let's say, at 3 meters and the other one in the Z direction to 4 meters. So this will be basically the interior of our little hut or little shed. In the engine later we will only import one of those, obviously, and then duplicate that in the engine. But it's a good practice to have that still in the viewport, or have it in your scene as kind of a visual reference, so you know how things are gonna look later on. So what is the next thing that we're gonna need for this is some beams here in the upper part, and I want those beams to be slightly tilted so they match the slanting of the roof. We create a new mesh layer and also start with a cube, and by holding Control while dragging it out, it keeps it uniform to those sides. And this is gonna be just slightly larger in diameter. I'm just pulling it out like this. I'm not too terribly worried about the middle alignment along this side here yet. Just want to see how that looks. I want to have this little bit of overlap in here, because when we separate that later, we won't see any discontinuities in the textures or something else. And yeah, it hides also quite a bit some of the lighting issues that we may have when using this with static lighting, which would only be applicable for complete indoor environments, but nevertheless it's good that we have it that way. So this is how that would look at the moment, but I want this to be slanted, so we rotate it about the slope that we want. We go for minus 17 degrees for roof slope. That roof slope that is quite a lot. So, and we drop the tool. And because we will use booleans to combine it, we don't have to worry about how we're gonna split that up, cut that up. That will all the booleans handle for us. And in contrast to the booleans with 3ds Max, where you have a lot of post-boolean cleanup work to do, here this works quite reasonable. So before we do that, we just mirror our item here to the other side. Put this at the correct middle. So here we have the same structure. Now we could already combine those elements with each other and then bool it against this, or we could have just created one row of items and then to take the other one from the roof, bool that together and then mirror the entire structure. There are many ways of doing it. What I tend to do is to push the Boolean operations very late in that process, so to have more options, because you could also iteratively bool, so taking the Boolean result and then bool that against some other things, or use that as a cutter for a subtractive Boolean. But the less Boolean operations you do in total, it's generally better for your mesh topology. You don't need to retopologize a lot later on. So now I selected here those edges of the inward side, and I hit Alt-C for cut. Alt-C will just create a cut here through my selection. I could also limit it only to my selections, because I don't need the outside cuts here as well. And the count I can increase, then it would create 2 splits. I have handles here to control the width for that. Can set it to uniform, then it will always snap to the uniform widthness. And that looks about just what I want, almost. So we move that a little bit up to the top. Drop our tool. Now I hit Alt-3 to convert it into a polygon selection, and I hit the bridge tool. Now it would just bridge it together like this, which is not very appealing. So let's increase the segments a little bit, and as you see, as I start to increase segments, we're getting this curved shape. Could even start twisting it, although you have to be really careful with those values here. So this geometry doesn't lend itself particularly well to twisting. Here are some other controls as well. So if it's not working out the way you expected, so let's say your bridging operation gives you basically the polygons you want, but they are all for some reason flipped because one of the edge loops that you selected is inverted, you can just flip the result in here and it will look right again. So if you initially get this kind of appearance, just flip the polygons and you're good. Also, so when you when you reverse the directions, when one edge loop is going clockwise and on the other part counterclockwise, then you can switch the direction of that loop and it will go to that. You could even define a guide curve, so instead of continuous segments, you could have it more like a wavy form or any other roof form. But we make a simple roof. We stick with just 2 segments, make it like this and hit the space bar. And I want to give this a little bit more overhang, so I select those 4, hit the B key for bevel and just bevel them out a little bit and a little bit inward. Spacebar. Those meshes here, since they are on the same plane, I can safely delete them. The same here and on the other side. Now here it's okay to do it like this because we only have 4 things to delete. But let's say we have something that's more complicated and we spend a lot of time just taking care about one part of this mesh. What we could also do, if it happens to be symmetrical like this one, is cutting it up, deleting everything except for a quarter, and when we finalized this part, then mirror it and put it back together. If we want to cut into things, not the way I did it before, like where I selected 2 or more edges and hit Alt-C, and this would give me then this edge cutter. I could, independent of any selections, hit Shift-C, and then I can draw a slicing plane into the world and move that around. And this slicing plane is actually just the plane that is visible. So if it's not going completely through an object, it's not like infinitely extended beyond that. So here you see that edge that is created by the slicing plane just stops here where the plane stops. So you can also just partially slice an object if that should be useful in your case. So now that we have these things here, we do something that we should do in Modo on a frequent basis. It's called the mesh cleanup. Because when Modo does its operation, it doesn't really care about certain things as normal values. You see this normal from this bottom face here looks rather strange. That's because Modo, if Modo would clean up the whole mesh every time you make a mesh operation, Modo would run super slow. So it keeps everything there in terms of geometry, but the rest gets messy pretty soon the more complex operations you perform. So every once in a while run this mesh cleanup command and it will check for floating vertices, one-point polygons, collinear vertices. It would merge vertices should they happen to be exactly above each other. It could unify polygons and so on. And if we click OK, we see that 9 face normals were flipped. So now let's combine that with our post meshes. We do these meshes here just as a sort of blocking meshes. So the real HUD that will go into the game will look a lot more sophisticated, of course. But just for a starter, we are going to do it this way that I'm showing you now. We will create several iterations of this HUD so I can show you different modeling techniques. So in this version we combine those two together now to one mesh, and I select the first mesh and select Boolean operation. The driving mesh is the background, our other mesh, that is okay. But we don't take subtraction, we take a union. Yep, it tells me it's not closed, which is true because we removed the bottoms. And now we see this, and you can see that the edges here are a bit darker black than here. That's because our original mesh, which was just the roof, is now overlaid over our original. Because when Modo does a Boolean operation, it will keep the original mesh there. So our original roof is still there. We could still do stuff with it, but we don't need it any longer, so we're removing it. And here we have our mesh with the appropriate cut out edges. And yeah, it just works without any further correction, except we do the obligatory mesh cleanup after such a Boolean operation, and again it cleaned up some of the vertices. And now we're creating some walls, or one wall segment that we can use then over on the other sides, and one front and one back wall segment. Now there are again several ways we could do this. I could, for example, create a new mesh layer. Now go in here and drag out a shape like this and try to scale it until it really hits in there. But even if I did that, we would still have some issue on the roof because it's slanted, and I would have to start fiddling with vertices, aligning them perfectly up there. That's one way, the hard way. But I could also make it everything just a little bit smaller. Make sure I'm between my walls and my top. Let's hit that exactly to 0 on the z-axis. And then I drop the tool. Now if I would just scale this box along either axis, it wouldn't be really much impressed by the background mesh. Since it's just a background mesh, nothing would happen. But if I go to my mesh constraints here and set the constraint mode to background, make sure the geometry constraint is set to vector, and then I click in the viewport to make this dialog go away. Notice that in my tool stack here the constraint to background is still active. I still have all my controls that I could set in here. And now if I scale my block, I cannot scale it beyond the constraints of my background mesh. So I select the top edges, or top vertices in this case. And now I just move them upwards. And the first one will stop moving when it hits this edge, and the second one when it hits this edge. So drop the tool. So that would give me also this perfect matching sloped edge on my upper wall face here, which we could delete since it's not visible in the game. But let me just show you another method that could be applied here. Since I have already my side walls here, I could use them to create a cube as well. I just copy my two faces that I have here, Control C, N for new mesh layer, Control V. Now I have my two polygons in here. Of course they are facing the wrong side, so I hit the F key to flip them around. I select both edge loops, and let me first disable this. After you have done such mesh constraint operations, always make sure to disable it. Otherwise you get some funny results when you forget it and then try to move stuff and wonder why Modo behaves so weirdly. So now after we have selected our edge loops, we just bridge them together with 0. And there we would have like a full going wall through with no indentations. So we could even use this as a wall making method. Remember when I bridged this, I selected for remove polygons. That's why the edges here have no polygons, but if I select this edge loop and hit the P key for polygon, then they are right there. So yeah, that's one way of creating wall segments. But here we stick to the cube method. Now I'm showing this modeling rather detailed. In the future I will just do it more quickly and not commenting every step that I do. You can still follow along here with the buttons. I will then only explain things that are new or that are a little bit tricky to do. For now we just use the constraint method. So constraint to background and moving the vertices up. And we disable it. Now we can remove all our edge faces, and I can select them all 4 like this, or if I select 2 and press the up key on the keyboard, Modo will follow along and select all the edges around a certain object. So if you have a large complex object and want just select a strip of polygons once around the object, then you can do that very easy. You can even select patterns, and if you then hit the up key, then that pattern selection will continue like this. So you can also have it select only every second mesh polygon, but we're gonna look at this later anyways. So now here we have two faces for our wall, and we don't need the side faces for the wall, and still don't have to worry about any light bleeding. Light bleeding would basically occur if we would have only, like if I hide this one and imagine this one would be double-sided, only then we would have light bleeding issues, because due to rounding, yeah, light could sneak through this intersection here. But with two, the only places where light bleeding or light artifacts could occur would be within this wall, and yeah, the player will never see this interior part here. So there is no danger of screwing up the lighting for this. Now I want for my wall polygon these vertices being exactly where the posts are. This is at the 0 position. I could manually try to get it exactly to 0, or I go to the vertex tab and hit the set position key. There I can select a specific value for each axis. So I want to be at 0 at the y axis. Okay, that takes care of that. And now we have our wall and on our structure. Now we create the front part, and we do this basically the same way, although here I start with my two polygons that I have here. Control C, new mesh layer, Control V, F key flip. I select the polygons, I hit the bridge key, I deselect remove polygons, I'm gonna bridge them now, they stay. So just to illustrate that. So since we copied from our wall inside faces from these, the height of this one is perfect, as it should be. This part here we leave open for now. We're gonna fill in some little variations for that later, because I might want to have a beam, a supporting beam underneath the length side of this mesh. But this wall segment of course needs to be a bit smaller. Since it's a blocking out mesh, I'm not too overly concerned about exact measurements here. Just keep it somewhat in the real world scale. So this would be our parts that we have on our HUD. The foundation or anything, we don't care about that at the moment. So now let's look a bit further on our mesh. Here the normals are a bit strange, and if I take that polygon and bevel it on the plane just slightly inwards, we see that now we have perfectly nice normals, because we don't have don't have the surface here going immediately into an angled surface here, and on this small strip you really can't see that effect. So let's bring those in just slightly. Let's run final mesh cleanup. So, and that would be our meshes, but we cannot import them in the engine as they are right now. Let's start with our foundation, with our framework and roof, and look at the UV map, how that looks. So that's of course overlapping and all over the place. And in order to get a little bit better overview of things, first I'm going here in the viewport and deactivate my work plane. I don't need that. And I don't want my grid. I don't need that. But what I do want for my UV maps here is a viewport texture with UV maps, so I can see a little bit better what's going on. Okay. Now just to make heads and tails of this, I have everything selected by having nothing selected, and here in my UV tools I choose projection, but not like this, not planar. This would be like planar from above, so everything on the side here is maximally stretched. We go for Atlas just to see where we are in terms of UV islands. So if I select them all, you can see them here. And that default unwrapping doesn't look too bad actually. Might not have to change a lot, although we could go in and align those a little bit better in terms of the seams and stitching it a little bit better together, but not for a preview mesh like this. And then we go to our next mesh, see how that looks. Also there we're gonna project it onto the entire UV space. Yep, that's okay. And if I delete that here, I can work just here in this viewport as in the modeling viewport. As I said, it's just it's not a different editing mode or something, it's just a different way of laying out things. I could also add here a UV layout in addition to that if I wanted to. So this really just splits the viewport into different layout setups. And also we're gonna flip this. So we end up with a UV map that looks like this, and that's quite okay. If we want, we could look at it how it would look in the renderer. So that's the appearance in here. Poly count wise, we see here 264 polygons, so we could dump a whole lot of these structures into the level with ease. Now we're gonna save that out. First we save the project file, and we save that in our assets folder. We create a new subfolder called meshes, and inside meshes a new folder called source. And inside this, let's call this hot mesh. So now we have saved that. And now we're gonna name our layers. This would be the HUD frame mesh, if I can spell that right. This would be the, let's just call it long panel as opposed to the short panel. Later, when we create the real HUD, we will use better names, and then also the roof will be an entirely separate piece, so we can have different roofs. Just wanna point out how it's done here on a high level, and for just a mock-up prop, it's good enough. Now the reason why we have named our meshes like this, just call it HUD frame, is when we select them all, we right click, select export selected layers. Let's select FBX and as separate files. I'm not using the Modo bridge here because not everybody might use Modo. So if you're working with Autodesk 3D Studio, then you can still follow along. So basically you would have to export your object as an FBX. By choosing separate files, I only have to supply a folder, and the FBXs will be written with their layer names. That's why we named them that way. So I go to my assets, meshes, yep, that folder, there it goes. And here we have them. There are our meshes. So when you make a bigger scene and organize your meshes, always make sure you assign proper names to your mesh layers. When you want to export them, then in one go, you create them as individual files very easily. I'm not gonna do much more in this episode. In the next episode, we're continuing refining this a little bit and creating also other meshes. I show you further modeling and control techniques that you can use in Modo or any other application, and then we do a bit more advanced things. So until then, have fun with modeling and the engine.